For the last 25 years, I have worked in the fast-paced and very exciting world of Formula One motor racing. The driver that I work with the longest is Lewis Hamilton. As soon as the news was leaked, the first thing that Mercedes did was to pull the team together and do a briefing in person so that everybody was able to hear the news. Very much a member of the team. He wasn't the superstar Michael Schumacher. He was, Michael who would come in and sit down and have a cup of coffee with you. Niki Lauda, who was just great fun to work with. A tough taskmaster to those around him sometimes, but just had such a great sense of humour and a real mischievous way about him as well. Always made me smile whenever I saw him.
Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the latest season of Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. I'm your host, F1 Black. And before I take a few weeks off, I thought I'd leave you with perhaps my favourite episode of all time. This week's guest, Nicole Bearne, has 25 years of front row Formula One experience, most recently at the Mercedes team, where she headed up internal communications. That means she's worked closely with Niki Lauda, Michael Schumacher, and of course Lewis Hamilton. You can probably tell that I'm excited about this episode, so why don't we just cut to the chase? So without further ado, let's welcome Nicole to the show. Nicole, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me to join you.
Oh no, it's our pleasure. So Nicole, we always ask our guests at the beginning, how would you introduce yourself to people that you didn't know, and particularly with your background? How would you say, I'm Nicole and I'm ...
I would say I'm Nicole, and for the last 25 years, I have worked in the fast-paced and very exciting world of Formula One motor racing.
Wow, I mean,
keep it simple.
There's plenty to unpick there. Yeah, right. That's a kind of alluring thing, and then people are going to ask the follow-up question. So, I mean, before we get into that 25 years of the fast-paced world of Formula One, what's your first memory? Do you have a sort of childhood memory of motorsport, or did you come to it later in life?
No, I do have childhood memories, actually. Not sort of directly related to being at races or anything, but when I was little, my father used to watch motor racing. He used to watch the Formula One races on the TV on Sunday afternoons when they were shown here in the UK. And I remember sort of quite early on, I think I was about 8 years old, and there was the sort of the James Hunt and Niki Lauda championship battle. And everybody in the UK was going crazy supporting James Hunt. And they all, it was this sort of James Hunt mania. Everybody wanted James Hunt to win. But my perspective was slightly different because when I was little, my nickname was Nikki, because obviously my name is Nicole. And we spelt Nikki the same way that Niki Lauda spells his name. And so I kind of grew up watching this battle on television where everybody was supporting James Hunt and I was secretly supporting Niki Lauda because he had my name. So I do remember that, watching those races way back in sort of around 1976 and secretly wanting Niki to win.
I mean, yeah, secretly to avoid ostracizing yourself from the British public.
Exactly. From the rest of the UK nation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you just I don't remember it personally, but looking at the clips, certainly there was a lot of fan pressure at the British Grand Prix that year when I think Hunt had been disqualified. I think he may have gone the wrong way down the pit lane or something sort of old school like that. And sort of the crowd essentially scared the organisers into letting him start the race. So
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. It was very partisan.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, sadly for you, your namesake Niki Lauda didn't win the championship that year, but he won it the next year.
He did absolutely, and and that's sort of gone down in history as well. So, and films made about it and all that sort of thing. But and then, of course, many years later, I had the privilege of working with him for a short period of time as well, which is one of my one of my, pinch me moments, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those incredible things where, perhaps it wouldn't be something you'd imagine would be possible even as a child. And I look forward to unpacking that. But I guess from that child that was secretly rooting for Niki Lauda, how did you go from that to ending up in motorsport? Presumably there's a sort of potted history or a story from A to B. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't set out to work in motorsport, that's for sure. I studied languages at school, was very keen to get out and travel the world, and decided to go to university to study languages as well. I studied Russian, and left university and spent 4 years living and working in Moscow. And came back from my stint in Moscow, worked for a Russian company based in London for a couple of years. And I was assistant, or sort of personal assistant, to the president of the company, who was a very, very wealthy Russian gentleman. And one day he said to me that he wanted to take some of his kind of core key business contacts for a day out at the British Grand Prix. Now, I'd never been to a Grand Prix race, but he asked me to make all the arrangements for them. And obviously, as Russians, with very wealthy Russians at the time, money was no object. So we arranged to fly in to Silverstone Circuit in the UK by helicopter and have the best seats in the house and the best hospitality. And he asked me to go with them just to make sure everything ran smoothly, which I did. And I saw my first Formula One race. That was 1995. I think Damon Hill won the race from pole position. And I was hooked. I just thought that was such fun, unbelievable. And so I went back in 96 and 97 to the British Grand Prix. But in the meantime, I had just become a big fan. I'd read books. I started subscribing to magazines about Formula One. This is, you can tell, before the internet. So you had to get paper books and things. But started listening to anything on the radio that I could find about Formula One on the sport radio stations. I started watching all the races on TV and just became a big fan. And then at the end of 1997, the company I was working for closed their London office and I got made redundant. And I thought, right, well, I'll just give it a couple of weeks and then I'll look for a new job. And shortly after the Christmas holiday, I got a newspaper in London and thought, right, I'll turn to the job pages at the back and see if I can find a job. And there it was. There was an advert in the back of the newspaper for a PA to the team principal of a brand new Formula One motor racing team. And I just thought, well, that's my job. So I applied and thankfully got the job. And that was the beginning of my Formula One journey.
I mean, and what a journey it was. So I remember I was watching Formula One around that time. And when BAR came into the sport, and that was clearly the team you sort of started out with, it seemed innovative and new. And obviously we look back now, it's a bit like listening to the Beatles. People love the Beatles, but actually a lot of it has been sort of copied and built on, and it's now popular music. And it's sort of, oh yeah, okay, the Beatles, fine. The BAR, with in terms of the way that they did sponsorship, the way they just burst into the sport, signing a world champion. Was it as exciting as it looked, being part of the story there yourself?
It was. It was like being in a Formula One startup. It was like, when I joined the team, I think there were 12 of us. I was working out of an apartment in London that my boss rented. We didn't have a factory. We were sort of in the process of building a factory on this sort of small piece of land in a middle of the UK market town. When I first visited the land, it was a field with cows in it. We were in the process of purchasing. In the first year that we were sort of getting the team ready, we bought a very, very famous racing brand called Tyrrell. And Tyrrell had been in the sport since 1964. And they were, Ken Tyrrell was one of the stalwarts of Formula One and one of the biggest sort of legendary names in Formula One for many, many years. So we were going through the process of transforming from, Tyrrell through to British American Racing, building this new factory, trying to recruit people to join the team, design a car. We knew we had the world champion driver joining us, so there was a lot of expectation around that. And it was very exciting. But I think, it was also unknown territory for so many of us. None of us, a lot of people within the team had never worked in Formula One before. So it had all of those learning experiences and all of the mistakes that we made because we just didn't know any better. It was a sort of, it was a baptism of fire in some respects, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely it was. And without, poking the needle here, because I remember at the time, and I remember thinking, Jacques Villeneuve, big name, all this big fanfare, the launch, and then it sort of didn't go as well as could be expected. I'm looking at the results. I don't want to remind you of it, but Villeneuve's car, retired, until round 12 when he came 15th.
It was just a dreadful first year.
How did it feel? I suppose you expected better. And how did that culture shift from that startup that had all that hope? And, how did it feel?
Definitely there were high hopes. I think one of the things that was interesting, so the technical director at the time was a gentleman called Adrian Reynard. And Adrian brought with him a huge amount of technical expertise in motorsport, in pretty much every category other than Formula One. And he had a reputation that every category that he had entered up until he got to Formula One, his car, the cars that he'd manufactured through Reynard Racing, had won their first race straight out of the box. And so, he'd done that in F3, he'd done it in IndyCar in America, he'd done it in a number of categories, number of series. So there was a sort of a sense that, wow, this is Adrian Reynard, he's won everything that he's entered so far. So there was a sense that the car would be good, because why wouldn't it be? But I think I don't think anybody really on the team had a sense of how difficult it is to win in Formula One in those days. We went out, we built a brand new state-of-the-art factory. We had great budgets. We pulled together a team of some great people. We had people that came with Jacques from Williams. We had some people that had been within other F1 teams. And we had high hopes, but we just didn't have a lot of consolidated F1 experience at the time, and it was very hard. The other challenge we were up against a little bit was that we were, especially in 1999 with the first season, we were underpowered. We were running a Renault Supertech engine, which was pretty much the only engine that we could get at that point in time, and so. That was a sort of a bottom of the grid type engine, really. And we just didn't have the reliability in the car, as you said. We had DNF after DNF. We didn't have the processes that are kind of sort of embedded into more well-established Formula One teams. It just took us a long time. We didn't win a race for pretty much the first 10 years of our operation. It took us to 2006 6 to do that. So, but we did all right. I mean, 2004 we came second in the championship, and that was 5 years after we actually started racing. So we came second to Ferrari that year. So we had sort of some success, but the first few years were very hard.
I can imagine, and you mentioned that, of course, BAR purchased the Tyrrell team. Were there any people that came over from Tyrrell, or was it quite a fresh start? You talked about building Brackley, and we'll get on to the fact that you have essentially stuck with all the Brackley teams through the history. But yeah, was there any experience from Tyrrell that came with them, or not so much?
There was a little, yeah. There were a few people who transferred across, who'd been with Tyrrell for a few years beforehand, but generally mainly on the manufacturing and design side. So Tyrrell's senior leadership team didn't move across with when we actually transferred the operation to Brackley. But we did get some good machinists and people like that from Tyrrell.
It does feel like a kind of changing of the guards in the sense that so I guess BAR was the advent of a brand buying into the sport, and we obviously know what Red Bull's done. And looking back before that with Tyrrell and Lotus that had gone out of the sport a few years before, and Williams obviously not doing so well these days, but having historically done well, a kind of shift from the privateer to the big brand.
Yes.
So you worked under, and we'll obviously talk about getting to work with Niki Lauda in person, and there's been some fantastic drivers, but you've worked with some larger than life team principals through the period. So I wonder if you're up for playing a bit of word association. Not too controversial, but
yeah.
Well, fingers crossed. I don't know. Be as controversial as you like. No pressure.
Give it a go.
So your first team principal was Craig Pollock. Word association. What's your abiding memory of Craig Pollock?
If I just had to sort of say one word, I would say brave, or maybe 2 words. I'd say entrepreneurial. I think what Craig did, he was quite visionary in that he had this vision of creating a Formula One team, and then he went about selling his vision to everybody else. And he was brave because it was a huge undertaking, to actually try and pull such a huge, brand new team together. But yeah, the legacy of what he created remains today. So I have, you have to take your hat off to what he achieved.
Absolutely. And I suppose now we take it for granted that team principals are articulate and media trained, but reflecting and trying to remember back. I think Craig Pollock might have been one of the first to do it relatively well. Like, compared to his sort of peers, counterparts, he was certainly head and shoulders above those on the grid. So David Richards came in a few years later. So what would you associate with him?
David is one of the, I don't know, he's like one of the statesmen of motorsport, really. He has such a pedigree, such a long history. I would say probably one of the most respected leaders. Sorry, I'm not doing one word here, am I? Maybe respected leader, definitely, in motorsport. I mean, he through rallying, through all the various different formulas, and also in automotive technology, as with his involvement with Aston Martin and other racing series. So yes, I think he's obviously now the chairman of Motorsport UK, which is the governing body of motorsport in Britain. So I think working with David, as sort of briefly in that sort of in the time that he was with Honda and BAR Honda, he was already one of the statesmen, or one of the sort of leaders within the sport.
No, absolutely. I remember because he was the chairman, might still be actually, of ProDrive, and
that's right. Yeah,
I think they ended up getting a potential entry into Formula One, but it was around the time when the regulations, they kept promising, okay, this year will be the new regulations, and they kept sort of messing them around, I guess, if I recall correctly.
They did with engines. Yeah, engines was the big one, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly, as you say, a statesman of Formula One, and obviously he was succeeded. And I remember him much more on the Honda years, but succeeded by Nick Fry. What word
Hmm.
association? What do you remember about Nick Fry?
Very approachable,
Hmm.
very innovative, and very visionary, I suppose. Again, he was another one where he had a real sense of where he wanted the team to go and what he wanted the team to achieve. And he would work very, very hard to pull that team together that could do that. And, to the extent that he identified that the team needed strong technical leadership, so he brought Ross Brawn on board after many, many, many months of trying to persuade him to come out of retirement or come off his sabbatical. But at the same time, Nick was one of these people you could always have a conversation. You could always chat with Nick. He would always stop and have a conversation. Always be very interested in what was going on in the factory. He wander around the machine shop and places like that and just kind of go and chat to people. So he was very hands-on.
It's really interesting to hear your observations of essentially different leadership styles, and we'll get to what you're doing at the moment later with the comms exchange and actually the different ways you can lead teams and build those cultures. And all of these names we've mentioned, obviously Craig essentially established that Brackley team that's still going strong today. David Richards was, I think, team principal when, as you said, BAR came second in the constructors, and I think Nick Fry was around when you got your first race win, and he brought in Ross Brawn, who we've all seen the Apple. I think it's Apple. Is it Apple or Prime? I don't want to make a mistake here. The documentary. Is it Prime?
It's Prime. No, it is. Gosh, now you've got me. Disney Plus. Sorry,
Disney. So I got it wrong. Both wrong. Okay, well, but Ross Brawn came out of retirement, as you say. He'd sort of spearheaded the resurgence of Ferrari, and had a challenging time at Honda for a variety of reasons. But suddenly the team was thrust into that uncertainty. And what do you remember about Ross Brawn's leadership? At the time, let alone watching the documentary.
Yeah, so I was Ross Brawn's personal assistant.
Oh, wow.
For 6 years. Basically, when Ross joined the team at the end of 2007, Nick Fry hunted me down. I was actually PA to the finance director at the time. And Nick hunted me down and said, would you be interested in moving across to work for Ross when he joins? And I didn't have to... I think it was like that 5-second pause because I felt like I ought to not just jump up and down and shout yes. So I was his EA for 6 years and worked alongside him. And word association, I would probably say pragmatic engineer, because he was one of the most methodical, pragmatic people that I have ever seen in terms of how he approached challenge. He was quite a strategic thinker. He was a quiet, he would think things over quietly, very calm, very measured, but with a wicked sense of humor. And so he would always have the sort of slightly wry smile and a bit of a twinkle in his eye if he saw something that amused him. And he would always create a very sort of open and welcoming atmosphere around him as well. So I have a huge respect for Ross, and thoroughly enjoyed working with him for that time.
Well, it strikes me that perhaps it's sort of the formative experiences in these kind of different backgrounds that each of these leaders have come from. You mentioned sort of the pragmatic engineer and Ross Brawn, and of course that's his background, and he obviously then took the company through the Mercedes buyout, but ultimately handed over to Toto Wolff, who's the CEO and team principal of the team today. So how closely did you work with Toto, and what are your major reflections on Toto?
So Toto came on board just before Ross moved out of the team, sort of 2011, 2012, I guess. And Toto's an incredibly charismatic leader. He is very curious, wants to understand everything around him. He's quite I would call him a disruptor in some respects, in a good way, in that he isn't afraid to challenge the accepted standard norms and ask questions and make you think about why things are being done the way they're being done. But he's one of those people that actually, again, similarly, when you're talking to him, he will give you his whole attention. He will listen very, very carefully, and he will take what you're telling him on board. So my relationship with him really was working alongside, the senior leadership team as head of internal communications, and just providing strategic and tactical advice on how best to communicate internally within the team in order to achieve its strategic objectives of winning races and winning world championships. So I spent time with Toto, arranging town hall meetings and employee gatherings and writing articles and things for the senior leadership team. So had a very good experience of seeing how he leads and his style as well.
It's interesting because from your description, you can hear someone with the background of a kind of investor that sort of buys into a business, seeks to understand it, as you say, seeks to challenge the underlying assumptions and make it go quicker, even if it's not a car. So let's jump around actually, because you talked about your role as head of internal communications at Mercedes, and let's not downplay it. It was an unprecedentedly successful period, 8 back-to-back constructors championships. What did what did you focus on? You talked about the objectives of the team, but how did you translate that, winning races, winning championships, into your sort of strategy for internal comms? What were you really trying to achieve?
So I think the important thing with internal communications, and just to kind of backtrack slightly before I answer your question, we were the first team really to identify that internal communications can provide a performance advantage to a team, having strong internal communications. And as in Formula One, we're always looking for performance advantage. And so what we did was to take a strategic approach to internal communications in the same way that we would have done with any other department within the organization. And the first part of that really was to understand the company's mission and really to have a very clear objective, which ultimately is to win world championships, but you have to break that down into something that is tangible, that people can understand. And the way that the leadership team did that at Mercedes, and I believe still do, is by creating a strategic intent every year. And that strategic intent would set out in a short written paragraph exactly what the team aims to achieve in any given year. And the role of internal communications really is to take that strategic intent, the vision of the organization, its values, and translate that into a culture that will enable the team to ultimately achieve its goals of winning races or winning championships. So within Mercedes, we were looking at, okay, what is our strategic intent for this year? How do we embed that within the team alongside our values, which were passion, respect, innovation, determination, and excellence? How do you create an organizational culture through communication that enables everybody to demonstrate the values, live the values, align with that strategy, and be very clear on how they contribute towards that overall strategic intent? We used to sort of describe it as being how you contribute your 10th of a second of the car, a 10th of a second of performance to the car on the track. And it didn't matter what area of the team you worked in, even if you weren't directly responsible for the performance of the car, you still had an impact on the performance of the car. You might be in HR, might be in finance, but you still had an impact on how the car would perform ultimately. And then at the same time, what we were trying to do was to create a listening environment. So an environment where communication was clear, it was open, it was honest, it was two-way, and an environment where it was safe to speak up so that people would be able to ask questions or challenge conventional thinking in the way that Toto did. And just to ensure that everybody was on the same page with what it was that we were trying to achieve as a team.
I mean, what you described there is fascinating. It reminds me of that story about, I think it was JFK or something, was visiting the NASA base and said, you've heard the story, but essentially said to a janitor, what are you doing here? Presumably sweeping the floor. It's like, I'm putting a man on the moon. And it's like the connecting what you do to the vision, the ultimate outcome you're trying to achieve as an organization.
Absolutely, because then everybody then can appreciate what it is that they need to do in order to achieve that. And I think the strategic intent approach is a really good one, because it enables people to look at the intent and to say, okay, so this is what the company is trying to achieve, what the team is trying to achieve. What do I personally have to do to fulfill that? And you can set your own objectives through actually creating that very clear line of sight to the intent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like we can all reflect, those listening at home and ourselves. We may have been in jobs where we were looking at the clock and trying to go home, or we've been in jobs where it's not even about that. We're thinking about how we can make things better. And we're like motivated by, what it is the job is and what it is the organization is trying to achieve. I guess before we talk, because I'm really keen to sort of hear some stories about the drivers you've worked with, but before we jump into that, obviously you left Mercedes, I'd say just over a year ago. And
8 months ago, yeah.
8 months, even fresher.
8 months ago.
and clearly, I'll come out and admit that I'm a Lewis Hamilton fan, I'm a Mercedes fan. And it's been a bit painful for me, being pragmatic and, being a grown up, I can take, the rough with the smooth. But, to see a high performance machine that is the Mercedes team and the challenges they're undergoing, what do you think it feels like at the moment in the team? And what do you think has sort of caused the challenges that they're going through at the moment, in your view?
I think it's goes back to a technical direction that the team took at the end of 2021, really, when the regulations were changed, and we had to build a brand new car for 2022, and this was the sort of the introduction of the ground effect cars with the floors that caused all the porpoising and bouncing all over the track. And as soon as that car came out, the team have been playing catch up ever since. They obviously went in a different direction with the technical development of that car. It turned out that the direction wasn't the best decision. They then had to make some significant changes to that car. But all the while that you are trying to bring your car up to the level of the rest of the cars on the track, and especially the lead cars like the Red Bulls, those Red Bulls are also developing their cars. And so you end up in a situation where you're just playing catch up, because as much as you can make 2 steps forward with your car, Red Bull will also be making 2 steps forward with their car, if not 3. And so you do get into a situation, if you go down that route, where it's very difficult to then rein the leading cars back in. And that's what happened, I think, a lot with the success of Mercedes in some respects. Mercedes made a very good engine decision created a very, very strong power unit back in the sort of 2014 season. Came out at the beginning of those regulations with a very strong engine, very strong chassis package, and it was very hard for a very long time for the other teams to catch up. And I think that happens in Formula One, where you have a regulation change and one team gets it right and others don't necessarily get it so right. And it just takes a long time for those other teams to try and build that parity with the leading teams again.
Makes sense.
But actually, going back to your question about what it must feel like in the team, I know from experience they will be utterly determined. And they will be very focused and trying to pull the team back up to the front of the grid again. They're a resilient bunch, so I know that they will be doing everything that they can to move forward.
No, absolutely, and I know that there were some seasons actually where they started, even in what we would address in sort of looking historically about a sort of a dominant period. There were the seasons where Mercedes would turn up at Bahrain and, you know, we as fans would say, "Oh, you're sandbagging," but maybe actually they hadn't got the front wing airflow right, and they had to sort of redevelop on the fly. So we know that the team is resilient, and I suppose I'm going to test the theory on you, perhaps fan to fan rather than seeking any internal knowledge. It's funny because there's a kind of Adrian Newey theme running through this, but you joined Formula One in the late 90s, and in advance of that, certainly Williams felt like they almost had an unassailable sort of technical dominance on the sport for certainly a few years. But in my view, they perhaps exposed their dominance too much and were winning races by a lap on the rest of the field. My theory, and I don't know how you could tell me I'm just chatting rubbish, I reckon Red Bull are even smarter than that and are not necessarily displaying the full performance of their car. And maybe this is too conspiratorial and it's not true, but essentially, if you're a leading team and you display too much dominance, then the regulations may change. Whereas when you see Red Bull, certainly in wet to dry scenarios, they don't know where to set their performance, and suddenly they might pull a second lap on the rest of the field, and then they rein it back in. I don't know how conspiratorial or how sort of outlandish is that theory, you know, about Red Bull certainly having that advantage, but perhaps hiding some of it to maintain it.
I would say undoubtedly they do have an advantage, but I think what you tend to do with a Formula One team, if you have a car like Red Bull do, and you have a driver like Max, and you know that Max could quite easily finish 17 seconds in front of the rest of the crowd or whatever it is, there's no need for him to do that. And there's no need for him to put that undue pressure on the car or on the power unit. You know, don't forget, we've got power units that have to last a long time nowadays within the sport. And you don't want to start taking engine penalties towards the end of the season because you've allowed your driver who's already leading the race to hurtle off into the distance and push the power unit too much. So when you are in a position where you have some dominance, the drivers may not be pushing to the full extent that they could, or may not be pushing the car to the full extent that they can. And that's where you see that, yes, there is more potential in the car, but they don't need to use it. And there's no point using it if you don't need to.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
It will give you, you know, you may find then you run into problems later in the season with power units and gearboxes and all of those other things that have to last the course.
And cost caps as well. I mean, is that spoken from experience, having been in the Mercedes camp during a period of, 2016 in particular was quite a dominant year, albeit both drivers really pushed each other to the end. and Malaysia is an obvious example of where an engine did fail. But yeah, were Mercedes sort of also balancing off that sort of desire not to over push the components?
You have to, especially with the cost cap, it becomes even more pertinent. But but you can't, unless you have to be in that battle, unless you have to push the car to its limits in order to win the race, then there's absolutely no point in doing that. If you're further down the grid and you desperately need to get the points, then yes, you push your car, and you take more risks, and you end up using more spares and more budget. But if there's no obvious return on that investment, as it were, then there's no point really doing it.
No, absolutely. It sounds a bit Alan Prost-esque in terms of sort of win the race at the slowest possible speed. And speaking of legendary drivers, you certainly work with a fair few, from sort of Jacques Villeneuve at the beginning, obviously Jenson Button carrying the team, and Rubens Barrichello, all the way through to sort of George Russell and Lewis Hamilton, in your final season. So do you have any sort of particularly fond memories of any of those drivers, and anything you'd love to share about working up close with any of them in particular?
Well, I suppose the driver that I worked with the longest is Lewis Hamilton, and so he was the driver that I had. I spent the most time with over the years. And I have some amazing, very fond memories because one of the roles that I held within the team was to manage all of our charitable activities as a team, so we did quite a lot of charity events where Lewis would come along and meet families, for example, of children with life-limiting conditions through the Make-A-Wish Foundation and charities similar to that. And we did a lot with disability as well over the years, and with schools and young people. And I think those are probably my fondest memories of working with Lewis, because he has such a you see a side of Lewis that you don't see on the television. He has an incredibly caring attitude, and just gets on so well with people and with families in that position. I think he has an innate connection, I suppose, perhaps through his brother, having grown up with Nicholas and his disability. He just connects very well with those sort of families and with people in that position. And I've seen him get down on the carpet and play with Lego cars with small children, and just have an amazing time with them. So it's a very different Lewis Hamilton that you see in those situations to the one that perhaps you see at the racetrack. And those are the moments I think I probably always treasure when I think back to my sort of time working with Lewis. But then I Michael Schumacher as well, was with the team for less time, but I worked with him a little bit and have a huge amount of respect for what he achieved, but also for who he was as a person as well. He was another huge icon of the sport. For me, it was, again, another one of those pinch me moments when he walked into the office for the first time. But when you met him, he was very down to earth, very curious, wanted to know all about you, all about your family, all about the, what you enjoyed doing in your spare time, that kind of thing. He would talk about his family. So again, very much a member of the team. He wasn't the superstar Michael Schumacher. He was, Michael who would come in and sit down and have a cup of coffee with you. So both of those have stood out for me. And then, as I mentioned right at the beginning as well, Niki Lauda, who was just great fun to work with, a tough taskmaster to those around him sometimes, but just had such a great sense of humour and a real mischievous way about him as well. Always made me smile whenever I saw him.
I mean, that is, in terms of a trio, talking of eras, talking of, people in their in their pomp, were considered the absolute greatest. That is an incredible set of stories that you must have, and I'm sure there are plenty more that perhaps you're either saving out of loyalty or saving for some memoirs down the road. I don't know. That is incredible, and what you say about Lewis is incredible too. It's sort of tear jerking in a way, and I guess my observation about sports people, and we're all guilty of it. I'm in my late 30s. We watch people play football or at the Olympics, and somehow we project onto them an assumption of maturity. But of course, Lewis Hamilton entered the sport at 23. He's now in his late 30s, pardon me.
Late
And
30s,
clearly, late 30s, people clearly grow up and people clearly mature. And I guess you got to experience Lewis over such a period of time that perhaps over those 10 years, he grew and matured as you were working with him.
Yes, I think he did. I think he definitely became more of a leader to the team in the years that he was working with us. I think he started off very much as a sort of, he was the driver, but you saw his leadership qualities grow as the team progressed, and as he grew with the team as well, and how he would be able to motivate people and build a great team around himself as well. So, and how, he would be the one that would be picking the team up sometimes when we had a difficult race. He would be back in the factory after it, and we'd get together and get the team together, and he would be the motivating factor to get everybody fired up again. So really an interesting person to work with.
I'm intrigued because, obviously your specialty is internal communications. We'll talk about the comms exchange really imminently, but you talked about Lewis as a leader. And I suppose what I'm always observing is at the end of the race, when he sort of, I don't know why, but Sky always tend to leave his interview to last, maybe because they know I'm waiting for it. But they have him in the pen, and the different, certainly sometimes when, let's say he's at Zandvoort, it was, I think, 2022, there'd been a little bit of a sort of strategic crossed wires at the end of the safety car, and George had come in and Lewis was in the lead, but he immediately got passed by Max, and Lewis dropped back and I think finished fourth. And I think on the cool down lap was perhaps not in the best of moods, but certainly by the time he got to the pen, you could see that he'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say and was almost communicating back to the factory about saying what a great job the team had done to give him the platform to even be competing for the win. Yeah. So how much of that played into your internal comms strategy in terms of what the drivers were saying and how you amplified that back at the factory?
So we have we had at Mercedes, we implemented a digital screen system. So we had digital TV screens up around the factory, and we used those to put up internal communications messaging and imagery. And one of the things that we would do after each race was we would pick up the quotes from the drivers at the end of the race, and we would put them on the screens in the factory so that anybody coming into the factory the next morning could see exactly what the driver had said at the end of the race. And invariably, that would be a thank you message to the team. It would be, huge thanks to everybody back in Brackley for all the hard work that they've put in this weekend in order to get me this car or to get these upgrades and it was just that moment, of recognition from the driver to the team to say, I know what you've been through to achieve this weekend. It's not taken for granted. It may not have been the best race, but still we're still pushing, we're still heading in the right direction. And that's really important, I think, because the drivers do have that leadership voice within the team, and they are ultimately the people that we hear from as soon as the race is finished. We also hear from Toto as well, and it's making sure that the messages that are coming back from those people are motivational and positive towards the factory, and that really made a big difference to the factory. Or it was very, very well appreciated.
Speaking of those kind of gems, I promise I'm not trying to steal all of your intellectual property, but you've essentially left that, I think you called it fast-paced world of Formula One and motorsport, And you've
Yeah.
set up your own company, the Comms Exchange, drawing on
Yeah.
those years of experience, all of those championships won, kind of setting a culture in an organization. What can
Yeah.
you tell us about those key lessons that you're trying to impart to your clients, or at least the free version that you'll give our listeners today?
So I think it comes back to that strategic approach to internal communication, thinking strategically about how you communicate and how your team communicates internally within the organization. And I say that there are a number of steps that you need to look at to take that strategic approach. And the first one really is to have a really good understanding of the situation that your organization is in, identifying your goals, understanding what it is that you're aiming to achieve, understanding how you would measure success against those goals, what good looks like, what success would be, how you're going to measure that, and then focusing on what the people that who are the people that you're actually communicating with, what are their thoughts, what are their needs, listening to them, thinking about what it is that you need them to know, to feel, and to do in order to achieve those objectives or those goals, and then work out the best way to communicate that with them. So what are their communication preferences? What are the best ways to reach them in a way that and then enable them to absorb that information or to feed back their own thoughts and concerns or questions. And then once you've got all of that information together, you can then start to plan your communications tactics, and you can work out which channels are going to be the most efficient. I think that there are a lot of communications within organizations misses out a huge chunk of that work and just goes straight to the tactics. We have a message, we need to send it out, we're just going to send it out. It'll be an email or something. And there is no thought to actually ensuring that it's going to be an effective email, or that the message is actually going to land in a way that people can change their behavior or understand something that they, understand what it is that they need to be doing. So then once you've implemented your communication, or you've sent your message out, you've then got to touch base with the audience and understand whether, what they understand from it. You've got to kind of measure whether it has created the outcome that you're looking for. So it's a more slightly more complex way of communicating, but it actually is a more impactful and more strategic way of communicating within an organization.
I mean, the two ends of the spectrum there, I'm hearing sort of measure whether what you've attempted to do has happened, which sounds very engineering-y. But then I think I heard there's some subtext there about, people's communication preferences. I think, we all, all of us listening know when a leader is, I guess, being inauthentic, and not necessarily out of malice, but because they've been on a training course and they've been told this is how you give, reassurance to your team, or do it in this exact way. And you're right, trying to be yourself, be authentic, but at the same time deliver the objectives that you're trying to deliver.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it, leadership, every leader has their own leadership style, but just being open, being honest, and encouraging transparency within an organization. Within the Formula One team, we were very transparent, very open, very honest, and we built a lot of trust. And I think that's a really important element of creating strong culture, is for leaders to place their trust in their teams, and because that trust will breed trust in return. And so employees are more likely to trust their leaders if they feel trusted themselves. And so, and you can do that with communication. You can share information with people in a way that really shows them that you trust them. And that will help you to then build that internal trust within your organization as well.
Absolutely. Give people the space to give even more than you'd expect them to give, because they see the problem and they're trying to solve it rather than giving commands. Absolutely.
Yeah, it builds that motivation, that sort of intrinsic. They want to help because they trust you, and they appreciate that you trust them.
No, absolutely. And before because I'm really keen, again, not to steal all your intellectual property, but hear your advice for those budding comms professionals or people thinking about how do you get into motorsport? What tips would you give me to survive in motorsport? But before we do that, I mean, just hearing about what you're saying about transparency, what was really intriguing about the recent news that Lewis was moving to Ferrari was, I think, the way that it kind of became apparent was that Mercedes called an all-staff meeting and announced it to everyone in the team. And I suppose that is how we found out, because we didn't know what the all staff was going to be about, and then we found out what it was afterwards. But I suppose that transparency was they wanted to give people the respect that they would all find out together. Do you think that's the culture that's still there at Mercedes? Do you think that's likely what happened?
It's definitely the culture that's there. I think on this occasion, actually, the cart went before the horse.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the news leaked somehow through, I think, as I understand it, from a journalist somewhere in mainland Europe, Spain or Italy. The news leaked somehow before Mercedes were able to gather the team together and give them the information directly. But the first thing that, as soon as the news was leaked, the first thing that Mercedes did was to pull the team together and do a briefing in person so that everybody was able to hear the news. But unfortunately, yes, what we generally tend to try to do is to communicate inside out. So we communicate first internally, make sure everybody's aware of the situation, and then we communicate externally. And that's really important for the team to hear things first, definitely. But yes, unfortunately, I think in this incident, it didn't quite work that way.
Yeah, those pesky external communicators getting there first. We've got to hold them back. So
Yeah,
look,
yes, a journalist somewhere picked up on it somehow.
yeah, exactly. Well, hopefully, yeah. I mean, hopefully it wasn't too much skullduggery and was, an honest mistake or a bit of naivety.
Perhaps,
And
yeah.
it's certainly, I wish I'd invested in Ferrari shares, before before the leak came out.
Yeah, they did well that day.
Yeah, absolutely, certainly. That's how you know if I knew, because my portfolio would look different. Anyway, I would have moved house. So, before we close, a couple of questions. I guess the penultimate one, really sort of, what advice would you give people? Because like we could do, I'm not going to keep you much longer, but we could go on for hours hearing these fantastic stories about both motorsport, but also like how you, at that elite level, drive that culture through communication. So what advice would you give to people earlier in their careers, sort of aspiring to any of the things that you've achieved in yours so far?
I wrote a blog on this actually on my LinkedIn site. So if anybody wants to find me on LinkedIn, they're welcome to read the whole thing. But just to sort of put a quick summary of it, I always say to people, think about, try to demonstrate that you can do the job to start with. If you want to work in communications, write some articles, write a blog, make your own YouTube videos, create your own social media channels, whichever sort of area of communications that you're looking to get into. Because if you you create your own social media channel or your own blog and then really make it excellent, people will pick up on it and people will notice it. Think about what makes you stand out from the crowd. Whenever there is a job advert that goes out for any kind of communications role in Formula One, you'll get hundreds of applications for it. I remember sifting through 500 applications just for an apprenticeship role when I was recruiting. So you have to think about what it is that makes you unique or makes you different to all of those other 500 people. And the one thing I used to say was, think about the things that you do away from your day job, because those are the things that will be different. Everybody else has got the communications background and the communications degree and that kind of thing. But, across the years at Mercedes, we had a world champion Irish dancer in legal, and we had a concert pianist in aerodynamics. And, you know, so it might be a sport that you play, or a significant achievement. You might have climbed a mountain or something. If you go into an interview and you can talk about that, it makes you stand out from the crowd. And then I would say just the third thing very quickly is just show the right kind of interest. If you, one of the things that we found over the last few years is obviously through the success of Drive to Survive, it's built the audience for Formula One in particular, but for motorsport as a whole. And people will quite often write to me or connect with me on social media, and they'll say, "Oh, I've been watching Drive to Survive and I'd really like to know how you can get a job in Formula One." And my answer is always, well, you need to do a little bit more than watch television. And I know it sounds cruel, but the idea is that actually, yes, it's brilliant that that TV show has sparked an interest, but think about what you can do to actually get involved, whether it's volunteering for a team, going to a racetrack, talking to people, just showing the right kind of interest, being prepared to roll up your sleeves and, you know, clean tires for a small motorsport company at the weekend, if that's what you want to get into, because you just never know who you're going to get talking to. People will recognize that. You'll get connections, you'll make network connections as well. So it's all worth trying to think about, sort of, what can I do to get a little bit closer to the sport.
Absolutely.
And the rest of it's on the LinkedIn article, so it's there if anybody wants to read it. It's quite long.
See, but that's smart. You see, that's sort of enticing. You know, that was I guess we call it a teaser, and you know, the rest of the content is on the LinkedIn. So is that the? I've just actually clicked follow, but is that the best place people can follow you on LinkedIn?
It is the best place to find me, or on my website, www.comms-exchange.com. But yeah, LinkedIn generally is where I tend to be most active.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, and on LinkedIn I can see that you are you have a little light bulb next to your name, and it says top internal communications voice. So
yes, I don't know why they do that. I didn't ask for it, but there you go.
Yeah, no, it's all right. It's cooler if you say that you didn't ask for it. No, I know you didn't. I know you didn't pay for it. It's all right. It's all right. It's not a verified badge. We know. So look, everything we've discussed leads us to this one moment, and it's just the most fundamental question to close the episode. So I guess the setup is, you know, and now you're worried, right? But I'm sure you don't need to be. But look, I presume on occasion you like a pizza every now and then.
I do. Yes, I have eaten pizza before. Yep.
Okay, you're like, where's this going to go? Okay, so yes, no question. Pineapple on pizza.
Sometimes.
That wasn't that convincing. I don't know.
Sorry, no, it's not. I have eaten it, but it's not my favourite topping. I tend to be a bit boring with pizzas concerned, and I quite like a sort of a ham and pie, you know, ham and cheese one or something. It's nothing too fancy.
Okay, well, maybe if you'd work for an Italian team, you know, you'd have a bit more prosciutto, or, you know.
Yes, like that, but, yes, it probably would have been slightly more exotic.
The Brackley area, sort of more of a ham, but occasional pineapple, but not too much.
Yeah, like, try not to sneak the pineapple on there. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I'm gonna put your kind of moderate answer down to your sort of multilingual background and your desire to reach all audiences. So, you know, that's the insight we gain from you on that. Okay. Well, look, Nicole, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. It's fantastic.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been good fun. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks, Nicole. And guys, if you've made it this far into the episode, then, you know, you have to give us that 5-star review. You have to put a comment wherever you listen to your podcast, or if you're on YouTube as well, give us that thumbs up. We are at Strip the Dip on all good social media platforms, but the most notably Instagram or X, formerly known as Twitter. This has been episode 8, I believe, of our 3rd series of Georgie's Stripping the Dipping. Plenty more where that came from. Look out for us next week. Go back to our back catalogue. But until then, good night. Bye.